Maplewood Lane was the kind of street that looked like it had been plucked straight out of a Hallmark movie. The houses were pristine, the lawns manicured to perfection, and the mailboxes stood like cheerful sentinels at the end of each driveway. It was a place where neighbors waved politely, children rode their bikes in the evenings, and the sound of lawnmowers filled the air on Saturday mornings. But beneath the surface of this idyllic suburban paradise, tensions simmered. At the center of it all was Judge Eleanor Hartman, a respected federal judge who had recently moved to Maplewood Lane after retiring from the bench. Eleanor was a woman of quiet strength and unwavering principles. She had spent her career upholding the law, and she had no intention of letting anyone trample over her rights, even in her retirement. Eleanor's home was a modest two-story colonial with a beautifully landscaped yard. The centerpiece of her garden was a pair of towering oak trees that had been planted by her late husband, Daniel, over 30 years ago. Those trees were more than just plants to Eleanor. They were a living memory of the man she had loved and lost. Every time she looked at them, she felt a connection to Daniel, a reminder of the life they had built together. But not everyone in the neighborhood shared Eleanor's appreciation for the oaks. The Maplewood Homeowners Association, HOA, led by its iron-fisted president, Margaret Hargrove, had strict rules about landscaping. Margaret was a woman who thrived on control. She had a reputation for being ruthless when it came to enforcing the HOA's bylaws, and she took great pleasure in wielding her power over the residents of Maplewood Lane. It all started with a letter. Eleanor had just returned from a morning walk when she noticed the envelope sticking out of her mailbox. It was a crisp, white envelope with the HOA's logo stamped in the corner. She opened it with a sense of foreboding, and her heart sank as she read the contents. The letter was a violation notice, citing her oak trees as a non-conforming use of landscaping that disrupted the visual harmony of the neighborhood. According to the notice, the trees had to be removed within 30 days, or Eleanor would face fines and possible legal action. Eleanor felt a surge of anger as she read the letter. She had lived in the neighborhood for less than 6 months, and already the HOA was trying to dictate what she could and couldn't do with her own property. She picked up the phone and called the number listed on the notice, hoping to reason with whoever was on the other end. The voice that answered was cold and clipped. Maplewood HOA, this is Margaret Hargrove. Eleanor took a deep breath, trying to keep her tone calm. This is Eleanor Hartman. I received a violation notice about my oak trees. I'd like to discuss this matter. Margaret's response was immediate and dismissive. The notice is clear, Mrs. Hartman. The trees are in violation of our bylaws, and they must be removed. If you fail to comply, we will take further action. Eleanor's jaw tightened. Those trees have been here for over 30 years. They're a part of my property, and I have no intention of removing them. Margaret's voice grew sharper. The bylaws are the bylaws, Mrs. Hartman. If you don't like them, perhaps Maplewood Lane isn't the right place for you. The conversation ended with a tense silence, and Eleanor hung up the phone, her mind racing. She knew this wasn't just about the trees. This was about power, control, and Margaret Hargrove's need to assert her authority over the neighborhood. The next few weeks were a blur of letters, emails, and increasingly hostile communications from the HOA. Eleanor tried to reason with Margaret, but the HOA president was unmovable. The violation notices piled up, each one more threatening than the last. Then, one Saturday morning, the unthinkable happened. Eleanor was in the kitchen, sipping her coffee and reading the newspaper, when she heard the sound of chainsaws outside. She rushed to the window and saw a group of workers in her yard, their machines roaring as they cut into one of her beloved oak trees. Her heart stopped. Without thinking, she ran outside, her voice rising above the noise. Stop! What do you think you're doing? The workers hesitated, looking at each other uncertainly. But then Margaret Hargrove appeared, striding across the lawn with a clipboard in hand. She was a tall, imposing woman with a sharp face and a perpetual scowl. Her eyes gleamed with satisfaction as she approached Eleanor. Mrs. Hartman, Margaret said, her voice dripping with condescension. I warned you. The trees have to go. Eleanor's hands trembled with rage. You have no right to do this. This is my property. Margaret smirked. The HOA has every right. You've been notified multiple times. If you had complied, we wouldn't be in this situation. Eleanor's mind raced. She knew she had to act quickly. She pulled out her phone and dialed 911, her voice shaking as she reported the trespass and property damage. The police arrived within minutes, but Margaret was ready for them. She handed the officers a stack of documents, pointing to the HOA's bylaws and a supposed court order authorizing the tree removal. The officers looked at each other, unsure of how to proceed. HOAs in the state had a lot of legal authority, and they didn't want to overstep. Eleanor, however, wasn't about to back down. She stepped forward, her voice steady despite the anger boiling inside her. "I am a federal judge," she said, her words cutting through the tension like a knife. "And I can assure you that this so-called court order is a fraud." The officers hesitated, and Margaret's smirk faltered for the first time. But she quickly recovered, her voice rising in defiance. "I don't care who you are. The HOA has rules, and you will follow them." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. She had spent her career dealing with people like Margaret bullies who thought they could bend the law to their will. But she wasn't about to let Margaret get away with this. The confrontation in Eleanor's yard was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, strange things began to happen in the neighborhood. Eleanor's car tires were slashed, and she received anonymous letters threatening her if she didn't drop her fight with the HOA. Other residents who had supported her also found themselves targeted, their homes vandalized, and their lives turned upside down. But Eleanor wasn't one to be intimidated. She began compiling evidence, documenting every act of vandalism, every threatening letter, and every violation of the HOA's own bylaws. She spent late nights poring over the HOA's financial records, uncovering a web of corruption that went far beyond Margaret Hargrove. What she discovered was shocking. The HOA had been embezzling funds for years, funneling money into the pockets of its board members and their allies. Margaret had been at the center of it all, using her position to enrich herself and her friends while the rest of the neighborhood suffered. Eleanor knew she had to act. She reached out to her contacts in the federal judiciary, and within days, a full-scale investigation was underway. Subpoenas were issued, bank accounts were frozen, and the once powerful HOA board found themselves under the scrutiny of state investigators. The final showdown took place at an emergency HOA meeting. The room was packed with residents, many of whom had come to see Margaret Hargrove's downfall. Eleanor stood at the front of the room, her evidence laid out before her. She presented photographs, financial records, and even a recording of Margaret ordering the destruction of her trees. Margaret tried to fight back, accusing Eleanor of forging evidence and lying to the community. But her protests fell on deaf ears. One by one, the other board members turned on her, revealing the extent of her corruption and the lengths she had gone to maintain her power. In the end, Margaret was removed from her position, and the HOA was placed under new leadership. The residents of Maplewood Lane finally had the chance to rebuild their community, free from the tyranny of Margaret Hargrove. As for Eleanor, she replanted her oak trees, a symbol of her resilience and the memory of her late husband. The neighborhood began to heal, and Eleanor found a new sense of purpose in standing up for what was right. But as she sat on her porch one evening, watching the sun set over Maplewood Lane, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over, and Eleanor Hartman was ready for whatever came next. In the months that followed, the Maplewood HOA underwent a complete overhaul. New bylaws were put in place to ensure transparency and accountability, and the community came together to create a more inclusive and supportive environment. Eleanor became a local hero, her story inspiring others to stand up against corruption and fight for their rights. She continued to work with law enforcement to ensure that everyone involved in the HOA's corruption was held accountable. As for Margaret Hargrove, her fall from grace was complete. She faced multiple charges, including embezzlement, fraud, and property destruction. Her once powerful empire had crumbled, and she was left to face the consequences of her actions. But even as the neighborhood moved on, Eleanor couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The fight for justice had been won, but the scars of the past remained. And as she looked out over Maplewood Lane, she knew that the battle for truth and integrity was never truly over. The fall of Margaret Hargrove sent shockwaves through Maplewood Lane. The once feared HOA president was now a pariah, her name synonymous with corruption and abuse of power. The neighborhood, however, was far from peaceful. The revelations of embezzlement and fraud had left a deep scar, and trust in the HOA was at an all-time low. Eleanor Hartman, now a respected figure in the community, found herself at the center of the rebuilding effort. She had no desire to take on a leadership role, but the residents of Maplewood Lane looked to her for guidance. Her calm demeanor and unwavering sense of justice made her the natural choice to help steer the neighborhood toward a brighter future. The new HOA board, elected by the residents, was a stark contrast to the pre-VYS regime. Transparency and accountability were their guiding principles, and they worked tirelessly to restore the community's faith in the organization. Financial records were made public, and regular meetings were held to ensure that every resident had a voice. But not everyone was ready to move on. Some residents, emboldened by the downfall of Margaret Hargrove, began to push for more radical changes. They called for the complete dissolution of the HOA, arguing that it had become a tool for oppression rather than a means of maintaining the neighborhood's beauty and harmony. Eleanor understood their frustration, but she also knew that the HOA, when run properly, could serve a valuable purpose. She worked to bridge the divide, hosting town hall meetings where residents could voice their concerns and propose solutions. It was a delicate balancing act, but Eleanor's patience and diplomacy began to pay off. Just as the neighborhood was beginning to heal, a new threat emerged. A local real estate developer, Victor Langston, had set his sights on Maplewood Lane. Langston was known for his aggressive tactics and his ability to manipulate local governments to get what he wanted. He had a reputation for buying up properties in quiet neighborhoods, only to tear them down and replace them with luxury condominiums. Langston's interest in Maplewood Lane was no secret. He had already purchased several homes on the outskirts of the neighborhood, and rumors began to swirl that he was planning a massive redevelopment project. The residents were dead. Some saw it as an opportunity to increase property values, while others feared it would destroy the character of their community. Eleanor was wary of Langston's intentions. She had seen his handiwork in other neighborhoods, and she knew that his promises of progress often came at a high cost. She began to investigate his dealings, digging into his financial records and uncovering a pattern of shady business practices. What she found was alarming. Langston had ties to several corrupt officials in the local government, and he had a history of using intimidation and bribery to get his way. He had even been implicated in a scandal involving the illegal demolition of historic homes, though the charges had been dropped due to lack of evidence. Eleanor knew that Langston would stop at nothing to get what he wanted, and she was determined to protect her neighborhood from his greed. She reached out to her contacts in the federal judiciary, as well as local law enforcement, to build a case against him. The battle between Eleanor and Victor Langston came to a head at a public hearing on the proposed redevelopment of Maplewood Lane. The room was packed with residents, many of whom had come to voice their opposition to the project. Langston, however, was confident. He had the support of several key officials, and he had already begun to buy off some of the residents with promises of lucrative payouts. Eleanor stood at the front of the room, her evidence laid out before her. She presented photographs, financial records, and sworn statements from former employees of Langston's company. She detailed his history of corruption and intimidation, and she called on the local government to reject his proposal. Langston, however, was not about to go down without a fight. He dismissed Eleanor's evidence as baseless accusations, and he accused her of trying to sabotage progress for her own personal gain. His supporters in the room cheered, and the atmosphere grew tense. But Eleanor was prepared. She had spent weeks building her case, and she knew that the truth was on her side. She called on several residents to testify, including a former employee of Langston's who had witnessed firsthand the illegal demolition of historic homes. The testimony was damning, and even Langston's supporters began to waver. In the end, the local government voted unanimously to reject Langston's proposal. The room erupted in cheers, and Eleanor felt a sense of relief wash over her. The neighborhood had been saved, but she knew that the fight was far from over. With Langston's plans thwarted, Maplewood Lane began to thrive once again. The new HOA board continued to work tirelessly to rebuild trust and foster a sense of community. The residents came together to organize events, from block parties to charity drives, and the neighborhood became a model of suburban harmony. Eleanor, however, remained vigilant. She knew that there would always be those who sought to exploit the system for their own gain, and she was determined to protect her community from future threats. She continued to work with law enforcement and local officials to ensure that Maplewood Lane remained a safe and welcoming place for all its residents. As for Victor Langston, his empire began to crumble. The evidence that Eleanor had uncovered led to a full-scale investigation into his business practices, and he was eventually indicted on multiple charges, including bribery, fraud, and illegal demolition. His fall from grace was swift and decisive, and he became a cautionary tale for those who sought to abuse their power. Years later, Maplewood Lane was a thriving community, known for its strong sense of unity and its commitment to justice. The oak trees in Eleanor's yard had grown tall and strong, a symbol of resilience and the enduring power of truth. Eleanor, now in her late 70s, sat on her porch one evening, watching the sun set over the neighborhood she had fought so hard to protect. She thought about the battles she had fought, the victories she had won, and the lessons she had learned along the way. She knew that the fight for justice was never truly over, but she also knew that as long as there were people willing to stand up for what was right, there was hope. And as she looked out over Maplewood Lane, she felt a deep sense of pride in what she and her neighbors had accomplished. The story of Maplewood Lane was a testament to the power of community, the importance of standing up for what is right, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. And as long as there were people like Eleanor Hartman to lead the way, the future was bright. Despite the newfound peace in Maplewood Lane, Eleanor Hartman couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The neighborhood had healed, and the residents had moved on, but Eleanor's sharp instincts told her that the shadows of the past hadn't completely disappeared. She had spent her life as a federal judge, and she knew that corruption had a way of resurfacing when least expected. One evening, as Eleanor was tending to her garden, she noticed a car slowly driving down the street. It wasn't unusual for neighbors to take evening strolls or for siders to pass through, but something about the car's slow, deliberate pace caught her attention. The windows were tinted, and the driver seemed to be scanning the houses as if looking for something or someone. Eleanor's heart quickened. She tried to brush it off as paranoia, but her instincts told her otherwise. She made a mental note of the car's make and model before it disappeared around the corner. Later that night, she mentioned it to her neighbor, Lucas, who had become a close friend and ally during the HOA scandal. "Probably nothing," Lucas said, trying to reassure her. "But I'll keep an eye out, just in case." But Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Over the next few days, she noticed more strange occurrences: a package left on her doorstep with no return address, a series of hang-up calls in the middle of the night, and once, she thought she saw a shadowy figure lurking near her garage. Each incident was small on its own, but together, they painted a troubling picture. One morning, Eleanor received a letter in the mail. The envelope was plain, with no return address, but the handwriting on the front was unmistakable. It was Margaret Hargrove's. Eleanor's hands trembled as she opened it. The letter was short and to the point. Margaret, now out on parole, claimed she had information about a new threat to Maplewood Lane. She insisted on meeting Eleanor in person, warning that the neighborhood was in danger once again. Eleanor was torn. Margaret had been the architect of so much pain and chaos, and trusting her was the last thing Eleanor wanted to do. But the letter's tone was urgent, and Eleanor couldn't ignore the possibility that Margaret might be telling the truth. Against her better judgment, Eleanor agreed to meet Margaret at a neutral location, a small cafe on the outskirts of town. When she arrived, Margaret was already there, sitting in a corner booth with a cup of coffee in front of her. She looked older, more worn down, but her eyes still had that sharp, calculating glint. "I know you don't trust me," Margaret began, cutting straight to the point. "And I don't blame you. But I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to warn you." Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Warn me about what?" Margaret hesitated, then pulled out a folder from her bag. Inside were documents, financial records, emails, and photographs that detailed a new scheme targeting Maplewood Lane. According to Margaret, a group of developers, led by a man named Victor Langston's former business partner, was planning to buy up properties in the neighborhood under false pretenses. Their goal was to force residents out and replace the homes with high-rise apartments. They're using shell companies to hide their identities, Margaret explained. And they've already started pressuring some of the older residents to sell. If they succeed, Maplewood Lane will be gone. Eleanor's mind raced. She had thought the battle was over, but it seemed the war was just beginning. Eleanor knew she couldn't fight this new threat alone. She reached out to the new HOA board, as well as her contacts in law enforcement, to share the information Margaret had pro-VY dead. Together, they began to investigate the developer's active VY ties, uncovering a web of deceit that stretched far beyond Maplewood Lane. The developers had ties to powerful figures in the local government, and they had been using their influence to push through zoning changes and secure permits for their projects. They had also been intimidating residents, offering them lowball prices for their homes and threatening legal action if they refused to sell. But Eleanor and her allies were determined to stop them. They organized a neighborhood-wide campaign to raise awareness about the developers' tactics and to rally support for their cause. They held meetings, distributed flyers, and even reached out to the media to expose the corruption. The fight was long and grueling, but slowly, they began to gain the upper hand. The developers, realizing that their scheme was unraveling, tried to retaliate with lawsuits and smear campaigns, but Eleanor and her team stood firm. In the end, the developers were forced to abandon their plans. The evidence against them was overwhelming, and the public outcry was too great to ignore. Several of the key figures involved were indicted on charges of fraud, bribery, and conspiracy, and the properties they had acquired were returned to their rightful owners. Maplewood Lane had been saved once again, but the VY Tory came at a cost. The fight had taken a toll on Eleanor, both physically and emotionally. She had spent so much of her life battling corruption and injustice, and she knew it was time to step back and let others take the lead. At a neighborhood celebration held in her honor, Eleanor stood before the crowd, her voice filled with pride and gratitude. "This community is stronger than any threat," she said. "And as long as we stand together, there's nothing we can't overcome." The residents cheered, their faces filled with admiration and respect. Eleanor had become more than just a neighbor. She was a symbol of hope and resilience. Years later, Eleanor Hartman passed away peacefully in her home, surrounded by friends and family. Her legacy lived on in the hearts of the people she had inspired and the community she had fought so hard to protect. Maplewood Lane remained a thriving, close-knit neighborhood, a testament to the power of unity and the importance of standing up for what is right. The oak trees in Eleanor's yard continued to grow, their branches reaching toward the sky, a reminder of the strength and resilience that had defined her life. And though the battles had been hard-fought, the lessons learned were clear. Justice, though sometimes delayed, would never be denied. And as long as there were people willing to fight for it, the future would always be bright. If you were the one in this story, how would you react? Would you stand up and fight back, or accept the unreasonable pressure and control from the HOA? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video with more people. Your small action gives us the motivation to keep bringing you more intense and engaging stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.